All right, in this brief video, what we're going to take a look at is how to prepare for the lecture essay on the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. So you're preparing a 5 to 8 paragraph response by responding to the essay prompt below, this thing right here. And to prepare for that, you need to respond to each learning objective that's listed below. So the first part of this essay is asking you to discuss the background material leading to the Declaration of Independence. That's covered in Learning Objective 1 and Learning Objective 2. And then you are going to discuss the structure of the Declaration of Independence. As you see there, that's going to be covered in Learning Objective 3. Finally, you're going to describe the function of the Declaration of Independence and its arguments of natural rights. That is going to be discussed in Learning Objective 4. So what we're going to do in this video is just provide, going forward, is to provide an analysis of the second part of the essay prompt based on Chapter 4, Tyranny is Tyranny. So the last part is asking you to specifically, referencing Chapter 4, Tyranny is Tyranny, identify at least 3 examples of how and why natural rights were violated during the American Revolution. Based on the Chapter 4 and the lecture, assess what made the American Revolution revolutionary, what made it not revolutionary. So let's begin by going through Chapter 4. So looking at Chapter 4, the central thesis of Howard Zinn's A People History of the United States centers on an attack on what's referred to as American exceptionalism. So American exceptionalism states that because of democratic institutions derived from its history and opportunity under of the law, all of these things, the wealth that's produced, the commitment to morality, anything that you can think of that is all good about being an American, there is something exceptional in its history, and if it's going forward, that is exceptional to all other nations, right? So Zinn, throughout the book, is attacking that notion. He basically is arguing that the political systems of the United States have always exploited the vast majority of citizens for the benefit of a small political and economic elite, whatever the variable, given whatever time period we're looking at. So if we're looking at the colonial time, we might be thinking of slaveholders. Looking at the Revolutionary era, we're looking at the members of the Continental Congress, so on and so forth, right? There's always going to be this variable. Going into the late 19th century, we're looking at captains of industry, right? The small elite group is always going to be the focus of what American government is for and what society seeks to promote. So Zinn basically is saying that America is not exceptional, but resembles the nations of Europe in which the colonists came from. So in Chapter 4, Tyranny is Tyranny, he provides a cornerstone of this argument by examining the motives of the Founding Fathers for starting the American Revolution. Zinn points out that the majority of those who signed the Declaration of Independence had already been colonial officials under King George III. And almost all of them came from a wealthy, educated elite. They were far more concerned by the leveling of movements, which were advocating for economic equality in the colonies, than they were by any threat from England when they went to war with England. It was largely to distract the common people who had been fighting the colonial elite on ideas of social justice and economic justice throughout the colonial period. We studied one of those in great detail, Bacon's Rebellion. There would be more rebellions throughout that, and that Zinn speaks to those rebellions throughout Chapter 4 as well. The tyranny of King George III, Zinn basically is explaining and arguing, was replaced, therefore, not with a popular revolution, but merely with another form of tyranny, that of the wealthy, conservative, colonial landowners, many of whom had ruled as proxies for the British Empire in any case, and who did not make any substantial changes when running the country on their own account, after the American Revolutionary War. One of the things that Zinn threads throughout chapter 4 is the profound irony that exists. So most of the irony centers around how the colonial elite criticized the King of England for his policies and then perpetrated similar offenses on the people that they governed. This made it clear at the end of the chapter. This is made real clear at the end of the chapter. There are a couple of examples of irony in that part alone. One such example is that the Declaration of Independence was signed the same year Adam Smith's treatise on capitalism was issued, on wealth, the book that he wrote, which was a celebration of the potential of capitalism and the merits of the economic system. And so Zinn points out that the Declaration calls for individual freedoms, yet throughout the book, Zinn chronicles how capitalism often tramples on the rights of the lower class. So chapter 4 concludes with the following paragraph. When the Declaration of Independence was read, with all of its flaming radical language, from the town hall balcony in Boston, it was read by Thomas Crafts, a member of the Loyal Nine Group, conservatives who had opposed militant action against the British. 4 days after the reading, the Boston Committee of Correspondence ordered the townsmen to show up on the common for a military draft. The rich, it turned out, could avoid the draft by paying for substitutes. The poor had to serve by law. This led to rioting and shouting. Tyranny is tyranny, let it come from who it may. So for Zinn, the fundamental argument that establishes the American Revolution was one of economic power and control. Zinn argues that the Founding Fathers were more concerned about consolidating their own economic control over the growing wealth system in the new nation. Zinn suggests that the primary motivation, again, was not to transform the ownership of the means of production in the nation, but rather to replace those who controlled it, swapping British with the upper-class patriots. So for Zinn, he suggests that the lack of authentic power distribution with the working class and inhabitants of the nation represents the fact that the dislike of the British was more along the lines of class and economic interests, as opposed to being in the name of a legitimate transformative vision of power. In Zinn's mind, had the British enabled greater sharing of wealth amongst the colonists, the revolution is not fought. And indeed, that's probably very true. Again, remembering the center of the central complaint of the colonists, both rich and poor, is that there is no, is that they have no representation. So as these taxes are being imposed, they're pointing out again, the colonists are pointing out again and again, we don't mind paying these taxes, but we would like to have representation. So the old Patrick Henry saying, no taxation without representation is what's being got at right there. Zinn goes even farther than this in his assertion that economic control was something that the colonists sought all along. So as written in the beginning of the chapter, after 1763, with England victorious over France in the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French Indian War, expelling them from North America, ambitious colonial leaders were no longer threatened by the French. They now had only two rivals left, the English and the Indians. The British, wooing the Indians, had declared Indian lands beyond the Appalachians out of bounds to whites. The Proclamation Line of 1763. So just to pause on that a second, what he's talking about here is the Proclamation Line of 1763. So it's this line right here, going all the way up to Maine and along the Appalachian all the way down, basically following the contours of the eastern seaboard, but inland towards the Ohio Basin Valley, right? This is going to be reserved for Indians. And basically, the thinking here from the British perspective is part of how that war happened is that it did come from colonists squatting in Native American land. And so to avoid future conflicts, they're basically carving out a place that is going to be off limits to British Americans in the colonies and reserved for Native Americans here. American colonists are going to be quite angry about that, simply because, from their perspective, they also fought in this war. Some of them fought in that war, including George Washington. And there's an interesting story about him. I'm not going to get into it, but there's an argument to be made that he sparked the beginning of the French Indian War between the British and the French. But we'll save that for another day. And from their perspective is, hey, we helped win this war, and we thought we were fighting this war because we thought we were going to open up more land for us to settle, and now you're saying to us, British, that we can't do that. So back to his quote. Perhaps once the British were out of the way, the Indians could be dealt with. And again, no conscious forethought strategy by colonial elite, but a growing awareness as events developed. So the emergence of the quote-unquote the colonial elite, unquote, is something that Zinn sees as denying the basic premise of revolution in the new nation. There is a significant threat to the democratic process for Zinn when he sees it invoked as nothing more than quote-unquote window dressing, or the idea that it is used to motivate people into action only to protect the economic interests of the very wealthy at the cost of the working class and at the cost of the poor in general. So for Zinn, the American Revolution is thus fought on the grounds that only change the faces of economic elite, and not anything that transform the state of affairs that enables the elite to exist. It is here where Zinn sees democracy being threatened.